Okay, we are about to have three interesting meetings, I think, and let me just give you the overall framework and then go into the details of our meeting today. I want to focus in our first meeting today on the Israeli political system and the Israeli society, primarily on the Israeli society. In the next meeting, next week, I want to speak primarily about economic issues relating very strongly to the corona crisis. And in the third meeting, I want to focus on Israeli security problems, particularly our relationship with Iran. Now, I realize that many are interested in what they have seen today and yesterday in the newspapers, and intentionally, this is not where I'm going. I'm not trying to give immediate answers to immediate questions in my lectures. We can bring it up in the Q&A, but not in my lectures. I want to speak about some fundamental issues that are underestimated and not dealt enough with at the media and also in the public discourse beyond the media. Let me start today when it comes to the Israeli society and the Israeli political system, first of all, to make a distinction between the two, because if you judge the Israeli society based on what you know on the political system, you will misjudge the Israeli society. And this is happening to a very large extent with the media, and even with the Israeli media, and with some even experts on Israel, who focus on the Israeli political system, see how dysfunctioning it is, and then they assume that the Israeli society is torn apart based on what they know on the political system. So let me make the distinction. First of all, explain why the Israeli political system is not functioning well, and then explain why the Israeli society may not be very aesthetic in the way it handles each other here in Israel, but when it comes to the overall performance of the Israeli society, it is magnificent. I mean, it is beyond functioning well. It is functioning much better than I would have expected under the circumstances that Israel needs to deal with. But let me start with the political system, and it's not functioning well. But remember, no political system in a democracy recently is functioning very well. Look at the Americans. We're speaking about 330 million people. What are the choices given to the American people? Trump or Hillary Clinton? Trump or Biden? Not exactly the best thing the American society can produce. We are having problems throughout Europe with democracies, primarily because in elections we don't get a clear decision. So every politician must be constantly in an election campaign. He must constantly produce results. These results must be short-term, so you cannot invest in long-term processes that will produce much, much better results if you are willing to wait a little bit for it. He must constantly pretend to be doing what looks well at the expense of what is well. Let me explain this distinction. It's very important. And again, not just in the Israeli democracy, in the Israeli political system, it is important when you look at the overall picture far beyond the case of Israel. We all say to ourselves that transparency is good, and I agree. The question is, can there be too much of a good thing? And my answer is yes, in everything. There can be too much of a good thing. When you're too careful, you're being a coward. When you're too careful with your money, you're being stingy. When you're too perfect in your relations with people, you will never tell them what you think of them, and they will have no idea how to deal with you. We have it in the political system, and we've reached the point where we have too much transparency. And when you have too much transparency, you don't ask yourself what is good, you're asking yourself what looks good. You're not speaking to the subject, you're speaking to the protocol. You want the protocol to look good. And we are having this problem in a way that undermines the political system. In the political system, you used to have a very close relationship between power and responsibility. Today, those who have power don't have responsibility, and those who have 100% of the responsibility don't have enough power to do what they're responsible to do. So we are having throughout the Western world, throughout the democracies, a weakness in leadership. People like Ben-Gurion, like de Gaulle, like Roosevelt, like Churchill would not have been elected today. Somebody would find something that they said that is not perfect, and this would ruin them. Somebody would look at the immediate consequences of what they're doing, and they will not be satisfied, and they will not have enough power to change something that they need to change so that you get a much better result. This is universal. Imagine all these problems in the very extreme case of Israel, where the prime minister has to deal with existential problems. The kind of leadership that Israel needs is very difficult to get because nobody is perfect and politicians are not perfect because people are not perfect. And when you have a negative way to select the politicians, because many people who are very good don't want to go into politics, because the cost is too high, the result is that you are getting a political system that doesn't function well. I was recently in Washington and I said to people on Capitol Hill, I said, all my life I was looking for a political system that is less functional than the Israeli political system. Thank you, America. Okay? We have a major problem in the political system, and it is unpleasant, sometimes disgusting. But it's functioning. We have a government, it functions. It doesn't function well, but it functions. And the future of Israel is not determined by its government, it is determined by its society. And here is a very important distinction we need to make. We need to understand that all the enormous achievements of Israel need the cooperation of the government, but they are the product of the Israeli society. If Israel today is a rich country and not a poor country, it is not because all the governments were economically brilliant. It is because of the innovation of the Israelis, because of their energy, because of their willingness to work very hard, to understand problems, to look at them originally. If Israel today is very strong militarily, it is not because the Israeli government was perfect in every decision when it comes to security. It is because you have a commitment of Israelis to defend themselves. It is because a strong society also produces a strong army. So if you look at the achievements of Israel and the shortcomings of Israel, they're a product of the Israeli society. And let us look at the Israeli society and try to give an overview, to take a few major issues in the Israeli society and give an overview of what is happening here in some of the most important yardsticks that you should use when you judge a society. First of all, and this is not self-evident, we have produced a functioning Jewish people. Now, did we have a Jewish people for thousands of years? Yes. But have they been functioning as a people, as a collective? No. For almost 2,000 years, we had Jewish communities. Even if some communities were related, if you look at the two major blocks of the Israeli society today, the Ashkenazi and the Sephardic Jews, these Jewish communities for a very long time were not connected whatsoever. They were certainly not functioning as one coherent society. Actually, the exile has taken the Jews out of history in very many ways. And Zionism is the organization that, and the idea that returned the Jews as a collective, as a people, to human history. But the question was, will it work? And for a very long time, it was very unclear if this will work or not work. At the beginning of the state of Israel, you had people here who were a conglomerate. Ben-Gurion uses even tougher terms. He speaks about human dust. I think this is taking it a little too far. But it was a conglomerate. It was something that you could not certainly say this will function. People were brought together. They had a myth that united them. They had an ethos that united them. And it's important because they considered themselves Jews and they wanted to live with other Jews. But this was ideological. For a long time, this did not function as a people. And what you have today is something that developed very slowly. It was not there in the beginning. The solidarity of so many different people who came from so many different places who didn't feel in the beginning that they can function together, this very, very slowly started functioning. It did not function well in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s. It was still an open question. Let me remind you, we had elections in 1981, and some people said they were exaggerating, but there was a grain of truth in it, that we may have a civil war here between Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews. What happened here, and this is the enormous achievement of the Israeli society, much greater than all the others combined, is that this became one functioning society with tensions, serious tensions, but one functioning society. And the most important part demonstrated itself, reflected itself in mixed marriages. When you look at larger Israeli families, you will find today that there is hardly an Israeli family that is not mixed in one way or another, ethnically, culturally, Ashkenazi, Sephardic, what have you. And the children are already not in a position where they consider themselves to be primarily Ashkenazi or Sephardic. They are already Israeli in the best sense of the term. We are again the Jewish people. And this Jewish people that is functioning with a very high level of solidarity is today the majority of the Jewish people. We started out in my childhood with one-digit numbers in terms of the percentage of the Jews in Israel in the Jewish people. It was a very small community. Today we are about 12 times as many Jews as we used to be in 1948. This is a huge jump. And if you go back to 1933, it is even bigger. And this is something, Israel became the center of Jewish life. Very important. Only 40 years ago, there were twice as many Jews in America as you had in Israel. Today, you have more than 1 million Jews more in Israel than you have in the United States. And we are already having in Israel half the Jewish people, and inevitably we will become the majority of the Jewish people because you have a very large number of children here, no assimilation, and the result is that this society that has solidarity is also the focal point of Jewish life in the world. Now, you ask yourself, is this society functioning? And again, there are a lot of tensions, but the society has a very strong mainstream that is functioning very well. Do we have exceptions? Yes. The ultra-Orthodox community is not assimilated. They don't want to be assimilated in the mainstream in Israel, and that's a very, very major problem, perhaps the most difficult problem that Israel is facing, but they're less than 10% of the Israeli society. You have the Arabs in Israel who are a different people and are associated with Arab society rather than with the Israeli society. Is the Israeli society monolithic? No. Is it functioning well? Yes. Is there a process where people who are not in the mainstream basically accept what the mainstream is doing? I think yes. And whereas some of them are not happy with it, they nevertheless understand that this is what Israel is. And this mainstream is functioning very well with a very strong solidarity among the people. So this is the foundation. And this is more important than the others put together. But let me add a few more criteria so that we see a broader picture. Let us look at the security of Israel. And before you speak about the strategic strengths of the Israeli army, look at something that is not less important, namely the willingness of the mainstream of Israel to serve in the Israeli army, to understand that it's not only and not primarily a legal obligation, it is more than anything else a privilege. You want to serve in the Israeli army, you feel that there is a privilege to serve in the Israeli army. Does it cover the ultra-Orthodox? No. Does it cover most of the Arabs? No. But it covers the mainstream, the most important part of the Israeli society, which is responsible to all of the achievements of Israel, to the economical achievements, to the scientific achievements, to the technological achievements. It is all the mainstream. The Arabs and the ultra-Orthodox contribute very, very little to it. So what counts is what is happening with the mainstream of the Israeli society. And the mainstream of the Israeli society serves in the only army in a democracy that is still going to war that has conscription. In other words, everybody in this mainstream goes to the army when they're 18 and they serve 2 or 3 years, women 2, men 3, and they serve in the Israeli army. And for most people in the mainstream, it is a privilege, and it is also the basis for a lot of what is happening in the Israeli society. Because the friends you make in the army will very often be your friends for life. Also, the people you don't like in the army will be the people you don't like for the rest of your life. But the friends are the people who will be with you very often. It is a place where people feel that they're doing the right thing. By the way, it has more credibility in the eyes of Israelis than any other institution. If you ask Israelis, who do you trust? It starts with the army, then Mossad and Shabak, then the judicial system, then the political system, and at the bottom of the barrel, the journalists. You ask me, it's a very healthy combination when the army is not a militaristic institution. Now, I know that this sounds very difficult to understand. One of the most important things about Israel is that because the army plays such an important role in the Israeli society, Israel couldn't afford to have the army become militaristic because then the Israeli society would become militaristic. So Israel, I don't know if you can call it this, demilitarized the army, not in the sense that it doesn't give the army weapons, but it removed militarism from it. And the Israeli army is more the combination of a militia and a youth movement than an army in the traditional sense of the term. To give you only one exception, one example, there is no translation in Hebrew to the term sir the way you use it usually in armies. For instance, in the in the American army. Israelis have a very different approach to their military service than most people have. So let's discuss the security situation of Israel beyond the army and see that it reflects the Israeli society. That's a very important part, because you cannot say, here is the society, here is the army. You want to understand the society, one of the most important institutions is go to the army. You want to understand the success of the army, ask yourself questions concerning the ability of the society to provide the army with what the army needs in terms of people who will carry out the most important functions. But now look at it strategically. Israel is perceived, and rightly so, as a regional power. Perhaps the most important, the most powerful country in the extended Middle East. This is not something that is to be taken lightly, because we are speaking about huge armies, unbelievable expenses in terms of purchasing arms, and Israel is a major power, and more important, the most important when it comes to discussing security. Israel can provide strategic deterrence. In other words, in a region where everybody kills his neighbors, this is what is happening in the Middle East for 100 years. This is the preoccupation of the societies in this region, to kill each other, to kill their neighbors. This is the most violent, unstable society you can possibly imagine throughout the Middle East. And the only reason that these countries don't attack Israel when they don't is that they're afraid of the Israeli military power. And that's the only way to prevent being attacked. Can you prevent it once and for all? No. Can you have perfect deterrence? No. Can it produce peace? No. But A, it can reduce the number of wars dramatically, and B, it can prevent the worst kinds of wars, the most threatening kinds of wars. For instance, for more than 40 years, we don't have war with Egypt. Okay, almost half a century, we don't have war with Egypt, primarily because of Israel's strategic deterrence. So we're speaking about an enormous success in terms of strategic deterrence. Does it mean that we have no problems? We have a very important problem now with Iran. By the way, this is the subject of our third meeting. But even the Iranians, in spite of the fact that we hit them every week in Syria, are not responding exclusively because of Israeli deterrence. So Israeli deterrence is very, very, very effective. And when it comes to security, it is very important. I've already spoken about solidarity, and I've already spoken about the Jewish perspective. Let me speak now very shortly, because I will devote a large part of it in the second meeting that we will have next week. Let me speak about the economy. The Israeli economy is solid. The standard of living in Israel is basically high. Unfortunately, the cost of living in Israel is very, very, very high, much higher than in Europe, and this is our failure, the failure of the Israeli economy. It has to do with monopolies in Israel. It has to do with trade unions being too strong. There are quite a number of issues here in Israel, but basically Israel turned from a poor state to a rich state. Now, you will read very often that in Israel, there is a very high rate of poverty, and very often also they bring you huge numbers in hundreds of thousands of poor children. This is pure demagogy because of political reasons that are primarily the result of the political power of the ultra-Orthodox in Israel. You have what we call a poverty scale that is totally twisted so that people are called poor that are not poor. For instance, it only measures how much you make, and it doesn't ask you if you have property. For instance, if you have an apartment that is yours, an apartment in Israel is very, very expensive, and the expenses for renting an apartment are considered something like a third of one's expenses. But somebody that has an apartment that is worth millions of shekels and sometimes even millions of dollars can still be considered poor if he reports an income that is not really checked properly. And this is politically orchestrated in a way that is designed to cheat the Israeli people, because it actually measures not poverty, but the uneven income. In other words, people who ideologically believe that there should not be a major discrepancy between people who make less and people who make more have called it poverty. It is nothing whatsoever to do with poverty. For instance, somebody whose real situation has improved can suddenly be called poor because they want to manipulate it and to say we need to give them more money. And most of the people who are poor are ultra-Orthodox and Muslim Arabs, not Jews that are not ultra-Orthodox and not Christian Arabs, because it has to do with people going to work or not. In the ultra-Orthodox community, men go to work very, very little, and in the Arab Muslim community, women go to work very, very little. So instead of having a two-income household, you have a one-income household and a very large number of children. And therefore, they are called poor because they're not willing to work the way other societies are willing to work. So first of all, the yardstick is distorted, and second, it has to do with the participation in the workforce. So is there poverty in Israel? Of course. Is it as high as presented? No. Is it manipulated politically? Yes. Basically, most Israelis live very well, and the section that doesn't live well has the bare minimum, and the society doesn't want them to have more than the bare minimum if they don't work. Okay? So, do we have a good system? I don't think so. It has many shortcomings. But do we have a system that is strongly poor? The answer is no. This is being manipulated. And basically, economically, Israel is in a good situation. Of course, some do better, some do badly. Now we have a major crisis. This is what we will discuss next week. After the corona, we have a very major crisis, and some of the structural weaknesses of the economy are coming out. So the question is, will we come out of it? How fast will we come out of it? At the expense of who will we come out of it? Let's discuss all of this next week. But basically, you just take the headline of economy. The answer is basically positive. Let us come now to something that, in a certain sense, is the most interesting, and you cannot do without it. It is indispensable. Namely, the question of the Israeli democracy. Do we have a strong democracy or a weak democracy? Now, in Israel, you will find something very interesting. Israelis like to exaggerate. Everything they don't like, They don't say it's not so good. They say it is catastrophic. And they say it about everything. It is a kind of popular sport in Israel to exaggerate dramatically because you want to capture the attention of people. And over time, the attention is not being given to somebody who does not demonstrate extremely. So you have today a joke in Israel that is called the black flags. Now remember what a black flag is. A black flag is the manifestation of the fact that you don't accept the rules of the game. It's a flag of anarchy as it developed at the end of the 19th century. It is a flag that says the very basis of society is not functioning, so we want to challenge everything. And the people who carry it, a small minority of people who do it for propaganda purposes, don't feel this way. This is not what they think, but they want to be heard. By the way, Israelis have learned that this is a manipulation and they don't take it very seriously. But journalists are very impressed by it and speak about it and write about it. And maybe you've heard about it. It's a joke. I mean, it's not even a serious argument. Now, do we have constantly in Israel people who say that democracy is in a bad shape? Yes. Usually, with very few exceptions, it is people who are not in power who basically say, if we are not in power, democracy is not functioning, and when we will be in power, democracy will function very well. I mean, look, for instance, at the people of Gantz, of the Blue and White Party. When they were not part of the system, they had a demonstration in Tel Aviv to save democracy in Israel. And one of the speakers was Ayman Odeh, who supports and excuses the Assad regime in Damascus. So it's a joke when you speak about democracy being in critical danger. If you say certain practices are not democratic, okay, sometimes you're right, sometimes you're wrong. If you're saying democracy is not functioning well, it is never functioning well enough. But if you say, as some have said, that the Israeli democracy is in danger, that we may be losing our democracy, this is a joke. It's no more than a joke. And by the way, the same people who said it in the election campaign, now when they're in government, they don't say it, okay? And the question is not when were they honest, here, now or before. The question is what motivates them to say one thing and what motivates them to say another thing. It is the question if they're in power or not in power. The Israeli democracy functions not better than all democracies in the world, and certainly not perfectly, but very, 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 very well. Let me explain a few things. It's very easy to have a democracy in Switzerland where you haven't had a war for a long time. Even in other parts of Europe, when you haven't had a war for a long time. Usually, when you're in war, democracy suffers. We are in war 140 years, even before the establishment of the State of Israel. And not only did it not suffer, it was built during a time of war. The people who came here came from Bolshevik Russia, they came from Poland, they came from, even those who came from Europe, came from the armpit of Europe, mostly. Then we got people from the Arab world. Most people who came to Israel had no experience in living in a pluralistic society. And yet we have developed in Israel a political system and a social system that borders on anarchy more than it borders on the other extreme. And sometimes we go too far in this direction just to be sure that we will not go in the other direction. So not only is it not diminished by national crisis, it is being strengthened in spite of national crisis. Look at the freedom of speech in Israel. You have members of the Israeli parliament who openly identify with terrorism and almost always identify with the worst enemies of Israel. And they say so very openly and they speak about it. And by the way, there is a law against it and it is not being used. Okay? So you have Arab members of Knesset who identify with the enemy in time of war, and yet they can speak freely. Now, you have Israelis who try to present themselves in Europe as dissidents because they have a developed sense of humor, and Europeans are sometimes supporting them. What they neglect to say is that in Israel, there is no real argument about the freedom of speech. What people call the freedom of speech is the freedom of being financed by the state when you're against the state. When you support terrorism, should the state support you? Should the state pay for it? When you undermine Israel, should the state pay for it? Okay? Now, it's a legitimate argument, but it has zero to do. And again, this is a distortion, a manipulation. It has zero to do with freedom of speech. You can say whatever you want. Not everything the government should finance. By the way, the government finances almost everything. Not everything, but almost everything, including very, very severe criticism and even questioning the legitimacy of Israel as a Jewish state. So in terms of freedom of speech, Israel is completely free and open. And whereas you may have a problem here and there, again, no perfect people in Israel, no perfect system in Israel, but compared to any other society under circumstances where you must observe certain limits, compared to any other society, Israel is in a very, very good state. Let me give you an interesting example here. We only have a few minutes, and I want to bring it in. We had a very interesting study by an American sociologist about the Israeli society, and they published a book called Startup Nation. And they say the strength of Israel is innovation, and then they say innovation comes from pluralism, and then they ask themselves, where do you learn pluralism? And their answer is in the Israeli army. So if you live in a society when you learn pluralism in the Israeli society, you're not in bad shape. When you have Arab members of Knesset who divide between those who identify with Arafat, those who identify with Assad, and those who identify with Hezbollah, and those who identify with Hamas. This is most Arab members of Knesset, and they serve in the Israeli Knesset, and they say all this, then you're basically in good shape. Last but not least, the resilience of the Israeli society. We have one of the lowest numbers of all OECD countries per capita who leave Israel. Now, remember, if you want to judge a society, and you have a very large part of the society, myself included, who has a European passport or an American passport, who speaks the languages, who has the qualifications, who is in demand in terms of his profession or her abilities, in demand outside of Israel, and can have a much better economic life than in Israel, and does not have to serve in the army. And the number of Israelis who leave Israel per capita is smaller than the number of people who leave European countries per capita. The resilience of this society is enormous. One small example, only recently I've seen a report about the area around Gaza that is under attack by Hamas. And everybody knows that this will not stop. We will have it for generations because of what the people in Gaza are. and you cannot find a house or a place to be because the demand to go to Gaza around the area of Gaza is so high. We're speaking about 1,200 Israeli families who moved in there, and you can't find vacant places Israelis go there. Israelis have learned to live with difficulties, and this also has to do with what we're about to discuss next week when we come to the economy. To sum up everything that I said today, whereas the Israeli political system is dysfunctioning, it is functioning well enough in an unsatisfactory way that I don't like, in order not to be able to stop the Israeli society from making Israel a very good place to live in, with enormous achievements and a great prospect for the future. So if you want to look at Israel, look at the political system, bring all the criticism, look at the society and bring all the criticism. And there is a lot to criticize, but look at the overall picture. The Israeli society is in very good shape. Let me stop here now and open the floor, I assume, for questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Dan. I am calling again to the people to, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen to ask your question, and keep it short. Before many questions come, I would like to ask the first question, Dan, and this is, could you name the top 3, in your opinion, problems of the Israeli democracy?
The problem of the Israeli democracy?
You said the Israeli democracy is not perfect, but it's functioning. But what are the top 3 problems you would like it to repair?
First of all, we have 2 societies. 2 of the 3 problems have to do with the 2 societies who are not democratic inside themselves. And I mean the ultra-Orthodox and the Arabs. Because the ultra-Orthodox are functioning in the Israeli democratic system by electing their representatives, but they're not free to elect their representatives the way they may have wanted, because their rabbis have used their political power in order to give them a schooling system that makes them unemployable. They don't want them to be able to feed themselves, and they want them to be completely dependent on the rabbis, because they are the ones who can give them the allowances that they get instead of working, and they keep them poor and uneducated. They don't study English, they don't study mathematics, and they are kept purposely unemployable. So do they participate in the democratic process? Yes, but do you have a very large society that is undemocratic and is basically oppressive inside? They're not using violence usually, but they're using social pressure in a brutal way. So you have one focus where the society, a part of the society, is not democratic. Another is the Arab society.
And this part, and this population group is growing, right? I think they expect it to have to be a quarter of the...
Because an ultra-Orthodox woman has 7.1 children, whereas a non-ultra-Orthodox woman has 3.1. Now, Israel has double the number than Europe when it comes to people who are not ultra-Orthodox, okay? And that's the best thing about Israel that I can possibly imagine. And the best yardstick to see how strong the Israeli society is, because to my mind, the best measure of optimism is children. So Israel having twice as many children in Europe, I mean the non-ultra-Orthodox, is very good, but the ultra-Orthodox have more than double this number. So at the moment, they're about 9% of the Israeli population, but it is frightening in terms of the long term, and again, also to democracy, because again, they use the democratic process, but the society is not democratic. The second is the Arab society. here you have a very interesting discrepancy between what most Arabs in Israel want and the kind of representative they elect. Most Israeli Arabs are proud to be Israelis, understand that they have the best life of any Arab in the region and perhaps of any Arab in the world, thanks to the Jewish state and thanks to the fact that it's not an Arab state and that Arabs don't determine what kind of Israel they have. And they want to become part of the Israeli society, at least economically. But then these same people elect almost only enemies of Israel as their representatives for the Knesset. It's a very interesting phenomenon. I don't have the time now to explain it. Why this is happening? Why are they voting against their interests? Because they would have been incorporated in the government had they not been electing almost exclusively people who are enemies of the Jewish state. So the question of why is interesting. We'll discuss it some other time, but the product is that whereas they benefit from the Israeli democratic system, they are not a democratic society, or let me put it this way, not a pluralistic society among themselves. If you will try today to organize a pro-Israeli demonstration, you will lose your position in your society. If you want to organize an anti-Israeli demonstration, even to support terrorists who are Israeli Arabs, who kill Israeli Jews. If you want to support such a demonstration, you will become popular in your own society. So these are two foci that are very disturbing. There are other parts, but this is true about every society. Go to the extreme right or go to the extreme left, and you will find elements who are being undemocratic. But this is something that every society deals with, and I think Israel also knows how to deal with. And of course, here and there, people are trying to promote a law that is undemocratic, but then it is being checked either by the political system or by the judicial system, and basically the overall picture is, I think, good.
But don't you think that the situation now that there is a prime minister who is charged for problems which are in fact against democracy, trying to influence the press and being influenced by big economic magnates is a risk to democracy, and talking against the juridical system?
No, I don't think so. It may be non-aesthetic, but it has nothing whatsoever to do with democracy. You ask the people, and the people say, we don't trust the judicial system, okay? And we think that even if he is corrupt, we want him as prime minister. Now, the kind of things he's being accused of is not the kind of treason or anything. And then the question is, what happens when practically every Israeli prime minister is under investigation and being charged with corruption? Remember, you have Netanyahu now, Olmert before him, Sharon before him, Barak before him. So this is something that many Israelis say, look, every prime minister, they will find something, okay? And they will charge him. So basically they're saying, if we're looking for a saint, then we will be looking for a long time. And Israelis believe you can be for it or you can be against it. But the majority of Israelis believe that the most important question is the person a good prime minister or not? For instance, who would you like to have as the President of the United States. Richard Nixon, I know that this is very difficult to say in Europe because Europeans don't like him, but the best president America had in foreign policy since the Second World War, okay? Or somebody who was a nice human being, like Jimmy Carter, who I think was the worst. So you don't get to elect people that are perfect. I can assure you one thing, the next Prime Minister of Israel will also be suspected and investigated because this is the Israeli system. You have today, also the president was investigated, Rubi Rivlin, okay? And others were investigated. So I don't think that it has to do with democracy. It has to do with the question of questioning the judgment of the people, okay? The majority of the Israelis said, we are not concerned to the extent that will prevent us from voting Netanyahu, the fact that he is probably corrupt or at least charged with corruption. And I think that the worst mistake that the opposition made was to make this the only issue that was discussed in 3 election campaigns. Nobody came with an alternative policy. The only question was, you're for Netanyahu or you're against Netanyahu. This, to me, is a problem when it comes to the democratic system. It is not a danger to democracy, but it is a problem when it comes to the democratic system.
Are you saying that, in fact, about the real issues of the Israeli society, the differences are not as big around the different political parties, or at least the majority of the Israeli society?
They're almost non-existent. They're almost non-existent. Let us take the 3 most important issues. First of all, our attitude vis-a-vis Iran. I don't know of any major disagreement in the mainstream of the Israeli society concerning the fact that Iran is a threat, concerning the fact that Israel must take military action to prevent them from establishing themselves in Syria, when everybody knows that this can bring thousands of missiles to Tel Aviv. And in spite of this fact, the overwhelming majority of the Israelis in the mainstream, I'm not speaking of Arabs who want the enemies of Israel to succeed. I'm speaking Arab members of Knesset, not Arab population, but Arab members of Knesset. And if you take, there is no real discussion on the most important issue concerning security. There is no real discussion about the profound mistrust of the Palestinians, knowing that no matter what you do with Gaza, they try to kill us more than they want to give their children a better life. No major disagreement in most of the Israeli political system. No major disagreement about not expecting the Palestinians in the West Bank to accept peace based on a historic compromise. Also, no major disagreement. There are minor disagreements, but not major disagreements. When it comes to the economy, we don't have in Israel either extreme capitalists or extreme socialists. Most Israelis are basically happy with the Israeli social economic system. Of course, everybody wants to take it a little more to his direction, okay? But not dramatically. People who try to run on this ticket failed systematically. So on most issues, Israelis, look at the last 3 election campaigns. It was never discussed. These 3 issues that are the most important have never been discussed. The only discussion was for Netanyahu, against Netanyahu, and even the very important discussion of the rule of the courts was organized very neatly so that everybody who supports Netanyahu wanted to weaken the Supreme Court, and everybody, or almost everybody, who wanted to undermine Netanyahu wanted to strengthen the Supreme Court. So that was the only thing in 3 election campaigns.
Dan, I feel that you are carrying a discussion with us, which is carried in the Israeli society very strongly so. And I don't think this is our position here to discuss this with you, but I feel you are very determined and forgetting that at least half of the Israeli society is having a lot of critique about things you were mentioning as facts, but I don't think we can discuss this
I
now
don't
because
think,
it's not our role, but just a
I
minute.
don't think
I want to go back
if
because
you,
our time is running. Excuse me, just a minute. Our time
okay,
is running and I would like to address some of the questions which were posed. If I may summarize what you're saying, you asked about what should be changed in the Israeli democracy or society, and I think the points you named, the changing some things about the Arab society and Arab Muslim society, as you called it, and changing some things about the ultra-Orthodox society. Is this a democracy question or is it a societal question? But what is the things that could be, is it a question of society that has to change or is it a democracy that has to change? I wasn't sure. You said democracy is not perfect
society,
and the question was, what should you change? Okay, so how can we change that? But before we go to that, or next to this, what is the main flaw of the Israeli democratic system at the moment, which needs to be changed? And I want to give you some background. Just a minute, I want to give you some background. You're talking to Dutch people, and you referred a lot to the American situation, but I can tell you that in Holland, people don't understand the situation which is happening in Israel. Not about having a prime minister who does not resign, having been charged. This is something people don't understand here. I understood you trying to explain that and saying this is the will of the people. This is not something that people understand here. And people do not understand the attacks on the juridical system. And I did not understand. You said if you look at the trust Israelis have, they have more trust in the juridical system than in the political system. And yet, you said the majority of the people do not want Netanyahu to resign and trust him for not having committed the crimes he's charged upon, which is strange because it's not upon the people to judge this kind of things.
Okay, first of all, you must understand that the perception of the Israeli mainstream is very different from the European mainstream in many ways, and Israelis have come to the point where they don't take the European criticism about what is happening in Israel very seriously. There is a small group of Israelis who have a position that they cannot get a lot of support from the Israeli people, and they want very much the Europeans to influence what is happening in Israel. But that's a very small minority. But let me start systematically with your questions. First of all, what is happening with the ultra-Orthodox and the Arab societies is a problem of the Israeli society, which is reflected very strongly in the Israeli political system, because you have here people who vote en bloc. In other words, these are not people who will have a variety of views. They will vote. If they're Arabs, they will vote for Arabs. If they're ultra-Orthodox, they will vote for ultra-Orthodox. So actually, you have three blocks in Israel. You have the Israeli mainstream, you have the Arab bloc, and you have the ultra-Orthodox bloc. I would like to see one day, I don't know if it's realistic, but that's what I would like to see one day, is an Israeli society where, regardless of where you come from, you vote the way you see fit, what you think is better for the country. It's impossible that every person who has a certain religious belief also must support the rabbis, the ultra-Orthodox rabbis, or everybody who was born Arab must support an Arab party and elect people who are very radically anti-Israeli, okay? This is something that is not healthy for the Israeli society. Now, what would I like to see in the Israeli society? I would like to see, first of all, because there is no major difference between what is called the right and what is called the left, I would like to see a government of a majority in the Knesset of the big two blocks in the mainstream without the ultra-Orthodox. Because the moment you stop giving billions to the ultra-Orthodox, they have to work. And when they work, they will meet regular Israelis, and the closed ultra-Orthodox society will open. So the most important thing I would like to see in the Israeli society is this: a government based on the consensus. And within this government, I want to see a discussion on the question of what to do with the West Bank. Look, we didn't come to this point. I wanted to discuss it when we come to the security issues, but I will mention it very shortly. I support for decades getting out unilaterally from most of the West Bank, because I know that peace with the Palestinians is impossible. It will not happen. And I don't want to control millions of Palestinians. So I want to leave the overwhelming majority of the West Bank and also to make changes in Jerusalem. Now, here is the interesting thing. When it comes to the right wing, they're saying, we are afraid that this will undermine our security. And part of the people are saying, this is the land of Israel and we must stay there forever. And when it comes to the left, they want peace. But if you persuade, and I think we're not very far from it, both sides, that on the one hand, peace is not a possibility. So the question is, can we get out or not get out, even without peace? Because if we wait for peace, we give the Palestinians the veto power over Israel. And to persuade the right wing, and the right wing did not annex the West Bank until now, in spite of the fact that we had prime ministers much more radical than Netanyahu. We had Shamir. Shamir was the most radical prime minister we had, and he did not annex the West Bank because he knew that there is no support for it in the mainstream of the Israeli people. And my understanding today is that Netanyahu will also not annex all the settlements in the West Bank, which tie the West Bank to Israel, but may consider the Jordan Valley, where everybody of any significance in the Israeli political system agrees that Israel should control the Jordan Valley, so that the Palestinians cannot use their entity in order to bring in hostile forces against Israel. So the only question is, should we annex now or later? Should we annex or only have military control? There are many variations, but nobody of any significance, perhaps 3% on the extreme left, think that Israel should not be present in the West Bank for a very, very, very long period of time. Okay? So I want people to gather around the consensus. And this will also strengthen the Israeli democracy. To my mind, and I know that Europeans look at it in a different way, but the Europeans can afford to have prime ministers that are, not capable of dealing with the kind of problems an Israeli prime minister needs to deal with. Okay? You can't be just a nice guy, only a nice guy, in order to be a prime minister of Israel. You can be a nice guy in Luxembourg. You can be a nice guy in the Netherlands. If you're only a nice guy, you can't be the prime minister of Israel. Okay? And Israelis are saying to themselves, are we looking for the perfect prime minister or for the good prime minister? A perfect prime minister is the worst enemy of a good prime minister. Now, Netanyahu anyway is on his way out. And the fact that most Israelis, including people who vote for him, don't like him, this is something that will be solved by him leaving political life. It may take 2 years or 4 years, but that's it. Okay? We have more serious questions to ask ourselves than the question of, is he indicted or is he not indicted? This is what most Israelis think. And even if most Europeans don't, I'm sure that they can do the right thing for European democracy, and the Israeli democracy will develop in a way that the Israelis want.
Dan, I have some questions, but are you going to talk in the third lecture more about the peace prospect and the Palestinians? So I will leave these questions for the third issue, and we'll add some questions.
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
Yes,
So
I will speak about it in spite of the fact that I don't think that it is important. I know it is important for people in Europe. I am very interested in it academically. I've written 3 books about it. So I will speak about it. But Iran is 1 million times more important than the Palestinians. The Palestinian
I'm asking a question, excuse me. I'm asking the question to see what questions I can still ask you now and what I can leave for another time. There is one comment that there is a comment here which says the fact that the Prime Minister is being taken to court proves the resilience of the Israeli democracy. This is one comment of people here. I'm losing some of the questions. Are you going to talk also about the political system and your opinion about the fact that what you mentioned, that there are people in the Israeli parliament who support Hamas or Syria or Fatah? Is this so maybe you should elaborate about this now. Do you think it's a good thing that they are in the Israeli parliament, or do you think they should be not allowed to take part in the Israeli democracy?
No, I want them to be in the Israeli parliament because the danger that they pose in the parliament is smaller than the danger of preventing them of being in the parliament. Okay? I don't have a problem with them as long as Israelis are not cheated by them. As long as Israelis know what they are, let them be in the parliament. But I will not bring them into the government. Okay? And I would not vote for a party who will bring these people into the government. I don't have a problem with Arabs in the government. I would not have had a problem if we had an Arab party that is not anti-Israeli in bringing them into the parliament, into the government. But when we speak about these particular people, about their very radical anti-Israeli views, I want them in the parliament and I don't want them in the government.
Why do you want them in parliament?
I want them in the parliament because I want every Arab in Israel to be able to reflect his views, and I want these views to be represented in the sovereign body of Israel.
I see. I have another question about the Israeli army. You said this is actually the real melting pot of the Israeli society, if I can translate your words shortly. What is it that makes the Israeli army different, except for the fact that there is no sir, I sir, in the army? You said, what's the secret of the Israeli army?
There are 3 elements there. First of all, Israelis understand that if the army will not be strong, we will be slaughtered. I mean, you just look about the people around us, and they have very few things that they want more than to kill us. So you need to have a strong army. The second thing is that it is not a professional army. Everyone goes there, again, except Arabs and ultra-Orthodox. Everybody goes there. You go there for 3 years, and then you learn what it is. You don't develop some fantasy about the army. You are a part of it. And you trust the army because you've been inside and you know what it is. And you know that even if the army wants to lie, it cannot lie because it will take 20 minutes and everybody will find out because everybody is in the army, serving in the reserve forces, has a friend there, a father there, a child there, a cousin there, a friend there, okay? And you lift the phone and in 20 minutes, you know exactly what happens. So the army cannot lie to you because it is so open because we are all part of it. You see, I was told decades ago that I did my service to the Israeli army, and they said thank you. And then they asked me if I'm willing to continue to serve. And I voluntarily continue to serve, and I serve until today in the army, in the reserve forces. And I feel great about it because I have the privilege of serving my country. And I want very much to be heard, to have an impact in the army, and I have an impact in the army. So that when you're part of it, and when you realized what it is, and when you were not broken in the army, but you felt that you were developed in the army, and let me give you the most important thing. When you are in the army and you're 19 or 20 years old, you will get more responsibilities than most people get when they're very successful in their career at the age of 50. And the moment you're given responsibility, you become a more responsible person. An Israeli, after 3 years in the army, is a different person than he was coming into the army, and he's a very different person from a European or an American who's never served in the army. So not only is it something you do for your country, it is something that your country does for you. And since the army is dealing with cutting edge technology, and most of the Israeli innovation is coming from people who learned this in the army, you also benefit personally for it. You see, when my daughter came out of the army and she looked for a temporary job, a high-tech firm offered her a salary 4 times higher than she would give other beginners, because they said, we know what you did in the army. We don't even know what we will do with you, but we know that we can use you very well. So first of all, come in, okay? So you contribute, you benefit, I'm not saying the army, like every other organization, doesn't have its stupid parts. And I'm not saying the army is perfect. And of course, the army makes mistakes and very often does stupid things like any other organization. But the experience of the overwhelming majority of Israelis in the mainstream of Israel is a very good experience. If you have today, for instance, 5 times as many people who want to go to the frontline, most dangerous units of Golani and Givati, it says something. If so many more people want to become pilots and navigators and high-tech people and intelligence people, then the army can accommodate. It is something that speaks about their own experience, their parents' experience, their brothers' experience in the army. So if I could suggest to the Europeans to have an army to help build their society, I would. It won't work in Europe, but I said if it could have worked in Europe, I think it would only benefit the society.
So what you're saying, it's transparency on the one hand, the fact that everybody goes there and you meet people you otherwise will not meet, and the people who are in the army get accelerated chances to develop themselves.
Not everybody, but very often. Let me give you another thing. I spoke before about Ashkenazi and Sephardic getting married. Where do you think most of them met? You see, we have something very insidious. We take people when their hormones are the most active, and we bring them into one thing, and a lot of interesting things happen. When I remember my army service and I'm proud of my achievements, it is not having stormed the enemy with a machine gun. I had other interesting experiences that I don't care to share with you at the moment.
Okay, thank you. There is another question, and this is regarding the deterrence you were talking about. Somebody asks, is the deterrence not totally and maybe completely dependent on the American support, financial and political and military?
No, it is only to a very, very minor extent dependent on it. here is the funny part. When it comes to Israel, we have 100 times more deterrence than the countries that rely on American troops to come to help them. The fact that we don't want American troops, the fact that we insist on fighting for ourselves is something that strengthens very much the Israeli deterrence, because the Arabs know we don't need to consult America before we do things to them that they don't like when they provoke us to do it. So does it help politically? Yes, the Americans will prevent the Europeans from putting sanctions on Israel in the Security Council. So it's very important to get American political help. Do we get American weapons? Yes, but only after we proved that we can produce it ourselves if the Americans don't give it to us. The Americans were not giving to us certain kinds of weapons until we proved that we can produce it ourselves. And on some issues, we are more advanced than the Americans. We get from the United States $3.8 billion, which is about 1% of the Israeli GDP. So you can imagine that with 1% less, we can also do 99%. Okay, when it comes to the military budget, it's more than 1%, but it helps. But most of this money is spent in America, gives jobs to Americans, and the United States has a lot of interests in the Middle East that are served by Israel, not because we want to help the Americans, but because we do it for ourselves. And the fringe benefits, the benefits that are not intended, are also benefits to the United States. So from an American point of view, it is much cheaper than giving money to NATO, and NATO does nothing, than to give, and they give much more money to European countries. So European countries can have a military budget less than 2%, and Israel's military budget is 5.5%. So we're speaking about something that also benefits the United States. And we have a lot of common interests. I mean, we are both against the radicals in the region. We are against Iran. We are against Hezbollah. We're against Daesh. We were against Saddam Hussein. So we are, by defending ourselves, we're also serving American interests. Does the American assistance help? Yes, yes. But would Israel have a deterrence without it? Yes. By the way, the one thing that would have changed if we didn't have American assistance is Israeli moderation. We can be moderate in our measures because we know we have the American assistance. If we knew we can't trust America, we would have to take much more serious and sometimes much more painful to the other side measures.
Well, we only have a few minutes still, but maybe you can elaborate shortly about, we talked about America, about the American support. What about the relationship with Russia? Is it relevant?
We have an overlap of interest. I wouldn't mention America and Russia in the same breath. Americans are our partners. With the Russians, we have to cohabitate because they're in Syria. If they would not have been in Syria, it would have been much better for Israel. But most of the Israeli important military actions against Iran take place in Syria. The Russians could have made it much more difficult for us to do what we must do in Syria. And therefore, the fact that we can have an understanding with the Russians is very helpful for Israel when we have to take measures in Syria. So we have with Russia, first of all, we don't clash on the most important interests. Their most important interest is to keep Assad in power. Our most important interest is to hit Iran. So if we hit Iran without hitting Assad, and if they can preserve Assad without stopping us from hitting Iran, then we can have an overlap of interests. Also, the Russians don't want Iran to be too strong in Syria, but let me discuss all of this when we come to the third element of security, because then I will lay the groundwork, I will explain why it is important for Israel to act in Syria, why Iran is by far the most important enemy of Israel, also of Europe, in the Middle East, and then I can also explain it. But our relations with Russia are because of the forced cohabitation between us and them in Syria.
Okay.
Are you still with me?
Now I'm with you. I just lost you for a minute. I hope the others did not lose you. But looking at the clock, I have to round up our meeting. I want to thank you very much, Dan, for a very interesting and very broad views of different aspects of this, and we will continue. I see there is one last question coming in, but I can't discuss it now because it's become too late. I'll keep this question for our next meeting. Just a minute. Yeah. Well, there is a question.
I was asked to say something about the. No. I'm sorry. I confused it with something else. No, I'm sorry.
Yeah. The question is about the relationship, the foreign relationship and foreign politics between Israel and the Netherlands. But I think we should discuss this in the future meetings we have. Or maybe I don't understand the question, seeing what the reactions are. So, but I will ask the person who asked the question to mail us the question. That's how I understood the question. We will keep it for next meeting. I want to thank you again very much. I want to thank the people who joined us here, and we'll see each other in a week time at 3:30 discussing the Israeli economy and economic things relate as a result or in the light of the Corona crisis in Israel. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Dan, very much. And until next week.
Thank you.